It's sequel time.
It's not surprising over time when a standalone movie achieves great success that there's a demand for a follow-up. Anything from 1978's Superman to 84's Terminator and 1993's Jurassic Park.
And of course, seeing how well Ghostbusters performed in 1984, fans had been demanding a sequel for years, and this was answered 5 years later in 1989 with the band coming back together for Ghostbusters 2.
Does it still hold up? Well, let's grab our proton packs and heat them back up as we revisit Ghostbusters 2.
I can't be the only one thinking that the biggest complaint about this movie is that it became way too kid-friendly.
And by the context of this, a lot of cursing was toned down to little to none, as the first movie had no problems dropping S-bombs, even from Egon, which you'd figure he would be the least obvious to swear.
The tone for this one was lighter. Considerably.
I think when you have a story about investigators/eliminators of supernatural activity, it's understandable that story aspects of ghost possessions and trying to prevent the coming of the apocalypse is not exactly family-friendly, in the same context as, say, Barney the Dinosaur. Although he's scary for a whole different reason. That and the animated series The Real Ghostbusters had been proving a hit with kid audiences that it just made sense to market the demographic as being more family-friendly. Which makes sense from a financial perspective as more could be made from sales of toys, t-shirts, costumes, and video sales.
Well, it was 1989. We didn't have DVDs back then. Too true.
The other aspect that was surprisingly well toned down was Peter Venkman's womanizing.
Considering how creepy and inappropriate he was in the first movie.
The story picks up 5 years after the events of the first movie, with the guys out of business after they were sued by the city, county, and state of New York with a bill so large, and it didn't help that there was a lack of spooky activity. It was a clever way to bring Dana Barrett back into the picture by having her son, Oscar, be the target of Vigo the Carpathian as a host to inhabit to live in the 21st century, and in turn a way to bring the Ghostbusters back into business. There are elements that are repeated from the first movie that, while they're good, it's something we've seen before, from a giant figure walking the streets of Manhattan to the montage of the Ghostbusters answering jobs. I think the only real creepy moments are with the disembodied heads in the abandoned subway tunnel and the River of Slime to Ray being possessed by Vigo, which had been kind of foreshadowed from the art museum earlier in the movie. One gag I think a lot of people got a smile out of was this.
He says the Titanic just arrived.
Well, better late than never.
To sum it up, it's not the worst sequel that Sony has ever put out. But it's not as good as the original. Although, most sequels rarely achieve the level of succession over an original. The late Ramis reprises his role as the stoic and intellectual Dr. Spangler, and he's in character incredibly well, like he walked onto this movie 5 minutes after the original ended.
And aged seemingly very little.
He plays off of his co-star and co-writer Dan Aykroyd perfectly as he brings in new tech from the Geiger meter and the slime throwers into the Ghostbusters arsenal. Dan is just as eager and enthusiastic as Ray as he was in the first movie, even though the character had to take a job as a book shopkeeper and doing ghostbusting as a side hustle for kids' birthday parties, which unbeknownst to the audience at the time got sassed by the future director of Ghostbusters Afterlife, Jason Reitman.
You know, my dad says you guys are full of crap.
Jason? Well, some people have trouble believing in the paranormal.
No, he just says you guys are full of crap, and that's why you went out of business.
And by He-Man.
Something's changed in the neighborhood. Who you gonna call? And it don't look good.
Clearly they didn't have the power.
I felt like this is another area that the first movie was being repeated in, as Ernie's screen time was probably on par with the first, as once the birthday party scene is done, we don't see Winston again until the business is back up and running. Which is a shame, because I felt like Ernie had a lot more charisma and moxie in this sequel compared to the limited scenes he had in the former. I was really glad with the material that Weaver was given in this, where she's still tied into the story but not the target this time. She displays motherly instincts for Oscar excellently as a mother that would do anything for her kid. I found it interesting that they managed to find a way to bring Lewis back into the story by being the Ghostbusters accountant and during their trial, their lawyer. It's a nice feel-good moment for the character when he believes that he lifted the slime covering the building outside wielding a spare proton pack.
Okay folks, this is basic villainy acting 101. You know you're doing your job well when you're disliked by both the audience and the characters.
Slimy, creepy, smarmy, and annoying.
And that's before he becomes a servant of evil.
I do like the way he makes it so obvious that he wants to chase tail with Dana when he says to Vigo what he's looking for in return, of which is reflected through Wilhelms von Homburg's facial expression as Vigo.
Viggy, you have been a bad monkey.
Great casting choice. A stoic villain who only wanted back in to do evil and rob an innocent of his being, and von Homburg did this in spades.
Alright, let's do this.
Murray returns as the lovable ass and, as mentioned earlier, seemingly restrained. Given how this movie had a much lighter tone compared to the former, his womanizing antics were toned down, although there is still some of that spark where Dana wants some of that roguish charm from him, but just for him to grow up.
And of course, he had to get one questionable line in.
It looks like a giant Jell-O mold.
I hate Jell-O.
Oh, come on, there's always room for Jell-O.
Damn it, Venkman!
Director Ivan Reitman had little interest in the technical aspect of the special effects of the movie. He brought in ILM and gave them the basic outline of what he wanted for the movie, giving them essentially free range for what they could do with the movie, of which the head supervisor was Dennis Murin, who would go on to be the visual effects supervisor for Jurassic Park 4 years later. ILM found Ghostbusters 2 the most challenging as the design and concept were always changing and they already had their hands full with Back to the Future Part 2 and Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade.
Slimer was redesigned to look a little more kid-friendly compared to his initial appearance in the first movie where he was terrorizing guests at the Sedgwick Hotel.
The disembodied heads in the subway tunnel are the thing of nightmares, as even for a more family-friendly picture, that scene goes to places. So the effects, 33 years later, they hold up well. Randy Elderman was brought in to replace Elmer Bernstein. Although he was familiar with Ghostbusters, he made the point of not watching it again even though he was responsible for the first film's score. Instead, he chose to focus on giving the sequel a distinctively different sound compared to the former. The soundtrack is very different compared to the first movie. While Ray Parker Jr.'s iconic Ghostbusters song still features, he also wrote an updated hip-hop version that was performed by Run DMC, which added its own flavor, and hip-hop was becoming more mainstream by the late 80s. Recording artist Bobby Brown, who also has a cameo as the Mayor's doorman, performed the track that got the best reception with On Our Own, which included in the music video the likes of Rick Moranis, the Troyster, and even Superman himself, the late Christopher Reeve. It's a great score, and it holds up. The movie grossed a profit of $215.4 million off a $30 to $40 million budget. In 2022, that's worth $498.3 million, which is $80 million less than its predecessor, even without the inflation adjustment. It earned $29 million on its opening weekend ahead of Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, and earned $102 million overseas, which brought its worldwide total to $215 million. Dave Kerr and USA Today's Mike Clark had their thoughts on the movie. They said that Ghostbusters had succeeded by projecting childlike fantasies onto adult characters who snubbed authority and bonded in a clubhouse, but by taking a surreal comedic fantasy and adding humanity to the central characters, the sequel had become 4 Ghostbusters and a Baby, a reference to the 1987 comedy film 3 Men and a Baby, directed by Leonard Nimoy. Roger Ebert called it a disappointment, saying he reviewed Ghostbusters 2 in a public screening and only heard one laugh during the entire film. Ivan Reitman had also blamed the film's performance for the audience's desire for darker stories, considering at the time Batman was released in theaters around that time, and the audience was flocking to that more as it was catering more to their desires. Some believe that it was Ghostbusters 2 that killed the franchise, and for a while it did, until... Ghostbusters 2 made less money than its predecessor, and as I've mentioned earlier, very mixed to negative reviews from critics and fans alike. It was the 9th top-earning movie of 1989. The top 3 were Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Batman, and Back to the Future Part 2. There wouldn't be a continuation of the story until 2021's Ghostbusters Afterlife, in which the surviving cast returned to aid a new generation of Ghostbusters, including the grandchildren of one Dr. Egon Spengler.
The movie has been enjoyed since 1989 on VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, and 4K. I'm MJ Knight, and we busted ghosts again for Ghostbusters 2.